Berlin, January 1939. The air in the lecture hall was thick with expectation as Werner Heisenberg, Nobel laureate in physics, adjusted his notes at the podium. Outside, winter's grip tightened on the city, but inside, the intellectual heat was palpable. Germany's most brilliant scientific minds had gathered, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights, reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The world beyond these walls was changing rapidly, and science, once a universal language transcending politics, was becoming entangled in the ambitions of nations. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had recently achieved something extraordinary, splitting the uranium atom. Their discovery, published just weeks before, had sent shockwaves through the international physics community. In the United States, Niels Bohr had brought the news, igniting fervent discussions among scientists who immediately grasped the potential implication. But here in Germany, the conversation took on a different tone, colored by the political reality of Nazi rule. Heisenberg began his lecture, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of unease. He explained the theory behind nuclear fission, the mechanism by which an atom could be split, releasing tremendous energy. As he spoke, his eyes occasionally scanned the audience, noting the presence of officials from the Reich Ministry of Education, their uniforms a stark contrast to the rumpled suits of the academics. The Nazi government had begun taking an interest in scientific research that could serve military purposes, and nuclear physics had suddenly become strategically important. The irony was not lost on Heisenberg. Just a few years earlier, many of his colleagues had been forced to flee Germany. Albert Einstein, the most famous physicist of the age, had renounced his membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences and left for the United States. Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, dozens of brilliant minds who had once contributed to Germany's scientific preeminence, were now in exile, driven away by Nazi racial policies that dismissed their work as Jewish physics. As Heisenberg concluded his lecture, a question came from the back of the hall. Could this energy be weaponized? The room fell silent. Heisenberg hesitated, choosing his words carefully. In theory, yes, he admitted. The energy released is enormous, but the practical challenges would be immense. The officials in the room exchanged meaningful glances, their interest now visibly piqued. The theoretical discussion had suddenly become a matter of national security. That evening, Heisenberg walked through the streets of Berlin, his mind racing. The snow crunched under his boots as he passed buildings adorned with swastika flags, the red and black banners illuminated by streetlights. Germany was preparing for war, and he had just confirmed that a new form of unimaginable power might be harnessed. The weight of responsibility settled upon him. Should he pursue this research? Could he control its application? Or would he become complicit in creating a weapon that could change warfare forever? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Princeton, New Jersey, Albert Einstein received a letter from his former colleague Leo Szilard. Szilard, who had conceived the nuclear chain reaction years before, was growing increasingly alarmed by the possibility that German scientists might develop atomic weapons. He urged Einstein to use his influence to warn the American government. Einstein, who had always considered himself a pacifist, now faced a moral dilemma. His scientific discovery, E=mc2, had made atomic weapons theoretically possible. Should he help America develop them before Germany did? Back in Germany, the Reich Research Council established the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, in September 1939, just days after Germany invaded Poland. Heisenberg was appointed one of its leading scientists. The race for the atomic bomb had begun, though few realized it at the time. In Norway, the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork began producing heavy water, a crucial component for nuclear research that would become a symbol of the scientific struggle to come. The world's greatest scientific minds were now divided, some working against their former homeland, others struggling with their conscience as they served a regime they despised. As 1939 drew to a close, the paths of these scientists diverged, set on courses that would determine the outcome of the war and shape the future of humanity. The heavy water flowing through the pipes of the Vemork plant carried with it the weight of history, as did the calculations being performed in laboratories across America and Germany. The arrogance of Nazi ideology, which had dismissed so many brilliant minds as undesirable, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to its own destruction, a fatal flaw in a regime that believed itself infallible. Berlin, April 1933. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service had been passed just weeks prior, its bureaucratic language masking a brutal purpose. The law mandated the dismissal of all civil servants, including university professors who were not of Aryan descent or who held political views deemed unacceptable to the Nazi regime. In the hallowed halls of German academia, a quiet terror began to settle. For decades, German Germany had been the undisputed center of the scientific world, a magnet for the greatest minds in physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Now, that legacy was being systematically dismantled. At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, the atmosphere was funereal. Max Planck, the venerable father of quantum theory and president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, had personally appealed to Adolf Hitler, hoping to reason with the new chancellor. He argued that dismissing Jewish scientists would cripple Germany's scientific standing. Hitler's response was a venomous tirade about the corrosive influence of Jews in all aspects of German life. Planck left the meeting shaken, realizing that the world he had dedicated his life to building was disintegrating. The old order of reason and intellectual pursuit was being replaced by one of blind ideology and hatred. The first to feel the axe was Fritz Haber, the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and a national hero. Haber, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 for his synthesis of ammonia, a process that had allowed Germany to manufacture explosives and continue fighting World War I after its nitrate supplies were cut off. He was a patriot who had served his country with distinction. Now he was being told his services were no longer required. "I was a German of the Jewish faith," he reportedly said, "and now I am a Jew in Germany." He died in exile in Switzerland a year later, a broken man. The exodus began in earnest. Train stations across Germany became scenes of poignant, desperate goodbyes. Scientists, carrying only what they could pack in a few suitcases, boarded trains for Paris, Zurich, and eventually the United States. They left behind not just their homes and careers, but a world they had helped create. Among them was a young, brilliant theorist named Edward Teller, who would later become a key figure in the development of the hydrogen bomb. He recalled the feeling of walking through the streets of Berlin, a city he loved, and seeing the swastikas proliferate, feeling like a stranger in his own home. The most significant departure was that of Albert Einstein. Einstein was already abroad when Hitler came to power, and he never returned to Germany. In a public statement, he renounced his citizenship, declaring that he would not live in a country where civil liberty is curtailed and freedom of speech and of the press are suppressed. His departure was a symbolic blow to the Nazi regime, which craved international legitimacy. Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to dismiss him, but the world knew better. The loss of Einstein was the loss of Germany's most famous scientific icon. The purge created a vacuum, and it was quickly filled by a new breed of academic, the ideologue. Theoretical physics, particularly the new quantum mechanics championed by Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and others, was denounced as Jewish physics, a convoluted, abstract discipline that stood in contrast to the Aryan physics, Deutsch physics, that was supposedly more intuitive and practical. The leading proponent of this pseudo-scientific nonsense was Nobel laureates Philipp Lenard and Johann Stark. They launched vicious attacks on Heisenberg himself, calling him a white Jew and a representative of the Einstein spirit. The battle for the soul of German science was being fought not in laboratories, but in newspaper editorials and political backrooms. Werner Heisenberg found himself in an increasingly precarious position. He was not Jewish, and his patriotism was unquestionable. He loved Germany, its culture, its language, its people, but he was also a product of the modern physics that the Nazis despised. He saw the beauty and power of quantum theory, and he knew that the Aryan physics movement was a dangerous, anti-intellectual farce. He was forced to navigate a treacherous political landscape, defending his work and his colleagues while trying to maintain his position within the scientific establishment. He wrote letters to officials, arguing for the importance of theoretical physics, and even appealed to SS chief Heinrich Himmler through a family connection to clear his name. It was a Faustian bargain, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The impact of the purge was immediate and catastrophic. University physics departments were gutted, research programs stalled. The vibrant intellectual community that had fostered groundbreaking discoveries was shattered. The Nazis, in their quest for racial purity, had amputated the brain of German science. They believed they were purging corruption, but they were actually excising genius. The scientists they drove away would not disappear. They would reconstitute themselves in new lands, bringing their knowledge and their ambition with them. In the United States, the arrival of these immigrant scientists was a godsend. American universities, which had long looked to Europe for scientific leadership, suddenly found themselves flooded with Nobel-caliber talent. Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist who was not Jewish but whose wife was, arrived in 1938 and went to Columbia University. He was the world's foremost expert on neutron physics, a field absolutely critical to understanding nuclear fission. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew of formidable intellect and restless energy, also arrived in New York. Szilard was a visionary, a man who could see the long-term implications of scientific discoveries with terrifying clarity. clarity. He had already patented the idea of a nuclear chain reaction in 1936, a prescient act that now seemed prophetic. The contrast between the scientific environments could not have been starker. In Germany, research was becoming centralized, militarized, and constrained by ideology. In the United States, it was decentralized, academic, and fueled by the influx of brilliant new minds. The émigrés, driven by a mixture of gratitude to their new country and a burning fear of what the Nazis might do, worked with a feverish intensity. They were not just doing science, they were fighting a war, using their intellects as weapons. This mass migration of talent set the stage for the great irony of the war. The Nazi regime, obsessed with creating a superweapon to ensure its domination of the world, had inadvertently armed its enemies with the very men who would make that superweapon a reality. They had declared war on a group of people based on their ancestry, and in doing so, they had created a formidable alliance of intellect that would turn against them. The purge was not just a moral crime, it was a strategic blunder of historic proportions. It was the first, and perhaps most critical, step in the Nazi program of self-destruction, a wound they inflicted upon themselves that would prove fatal. In a small laboratory at Columbia University in early 1939, Enrico Fermi and his team began bombarding uranium samples with neutrons, replicating and expanding upon Hahn and Strassman's work. The air in the lab was filled with the hum of equipment and the quiet, intense conversations of scientists on the verge of a new age. They were measuring the energy released, trying to understand the fundamental processes at play. They knew they were in a race, though they didn't yet know the identity of their opponent. They only knew that the stakes were unimaginably high. In Germany, Heisenberg and his colleagues were conducting similar experiments, but their progress was hampered by a lack of resources, a lack of collaboration, and the suffocating presence of a state that valued ideology over intellect. The race had begun, and one side had already hobbled itself at the starting line. The symbol of this era of separation and impending conflict was not a weapon, but a substance: heavy water. In the remote, snow-covered mountains of Norway, the Norsk hydro plant continued its operations, its gleaming pipes and vats producing a clear, odorless liquid that was, to the untrained eye, indistinguishable from ordinary water. But heavy water, containing a heavier isotope of hydrogen called deuterium, had the unique ability to slow down neutrons without absorbing them, making it an ideal moderator for a nuclear reactor. It was a key that could unlock the secret of controlled nuclear fission. Both the German and the Allied scientists knew its value. For the Germans, securing a steady supply of heavy water from Norway was essential to their atomic program. For the Allies, cutting off that supply was paramount. The quiet plan at Vemork had just become one of the most important strategic targets in the world. As the scientists in their laboratories grappled with the fundamental laws of the universe, the world outside was descending into chaos. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The theoretical discussions about atomic energy were now, irrevocably, discussions about atomic war. The exiled scientists who had hoped their warnings might prevent a conflict now saw their worst fears realized. The race for the bomb was no longer an academic competition. It was a desperate struggle for survival, a contest to see who could harness the power of the atom first. The purge had set the pieces on the board, and the game had begun. The race begins. Göttingen, Germany, September 1939. The formal convening of the Uranverein felt less like a scientific summit and more like a military briefing. The room in a building belonging to the Reich Post Office was Spartan and cold. A large map of Europe dominated one wall, already dotted with the markers of the swift conquest of Poland. The scientists present: Abraham Esau, Walther Gerlach, Kurt Diebner, and Werner Heisenberg among them, were a study in contrasts. Some, like Diebner, were relatively unknown physicists with strong Nazi party connections, eager to prove their loyalty. Others, like Heisenberg, were world-renowned figures who looked profoundly uncomfortable in the company of military men. The meeting was opened by Erich Schumann, the director of the Army's Physics Research Department. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice clipped and authoritative, "the Führer has unleashed a new form of warfare. We will achieve victory through technological superiority. The potential of uranium energy is one such technology. Your task is to determine if this energy can be harnessed for a weapon, and if so, to develop it. All necessary resources will be made available. The security of this project is of the highest priority. You will not discuss your work outside of this group. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent went through the room. The age of open scientific inquiry was over. It had been replaced by the dictates of the state. Heisenberg, who had been quietly observing, was then called upon to give a technical assessment. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the dimly lit room. He spoke with his characteristic precision, outlining outlining the theoretical challenges. He explained the concept of a chain reaction, the need for a moderator like heavy water or graphite to slow neutrons, and the immense difficulty of separating the fissile isotope uranium-235 from the far more abundant uranium-238. He concluded that while the energy release was theoretically enormous, the practical path to a bomb was long and fraught with uncertainty. It was a sober, honest assessment, but it was interpreted by the military men in the room as a lack of urgency. They wanted a wonder weapon, and Heisenberg was giving them a physics lecture. This initial meeting established a dynamic that would plague the German atomic program for its entire duration, a fundamental disconnect between the scientists and the military leadership. The scientists, led by Heisenberg, were cautious, methodical, and focused on the fundamental science. The military, driven by the demands of a war they expected to be short, wanted immediate, spectacular results. This lack of a unified, urgent vision would prove to be a crippling handicap, especially when compared to the single-minded, well-funded, and highly motivated effort that was soon to begin in the United States. Meanwhile, in New York City, a different kind of meeting was taking place. It was a sweltering summer day in late July 1939, and Leo Szilard had arrived at a small cottage on Long Island. He was there to see Albert Einstein. Szilard, ever the strategist, knew that a warning from a lesser-known scientist like himself would be ignored by the American government. But a warning from Einstein, that was a different matter entirely. Einstein, who had been enjoying a quiet summer of sailing and thinking, was initially reluctant to get involved, but Szilard, with his colleague Eugene Wigner, patiently explained the latest developments, the confirmation of fission, the possibility of a chain reaction, and the terrifying prospect that German scientists, led by Heisenberg, might be working on an atomic bomb for Hitler. Einstein listened intently, his famous mustache twitching with concern. He had always been a pacifist, but the thought of Hitler possessing such a weapon was a moral obscenity he could not abide. "I never thought of that," he reportedly said, shaking his head. He realized that his famous equation, E equals mc2, was no longer just a theoretical curiosity. It was a potential blueprint for destruction. He agreed to help. Szilard had already drafted a letter, and after some discussion and revisions, Einstein signed it. The letter was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Einstein-Szilard letter was a masterpiece of scientific and political communication. It was concise, clear, and deliberately alarming. It stated, "Some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard, which has been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Certain aspects of the situation which has arisen seem to call for watchfulness, and if necessary, quick action on the part of the administration. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory." The letter was delivered to the president in October 1939. Roosevelt, preoccupied with the Great Depression and the growing war in Europe, read it and expressed interest. He formed an advisory committee on uranium, the Uranium Committee, but it was small, underfunded, and moved with glacial slowness. The American government, like the German one, was not yet fully convinced of the bomb's potential. The critical difference, however, was one of potential. In America, the seed of an idea had been planted in fertile ground, watered by the genius of immigré scientists. In Germany, the seed was planted in barren soil, poisoned by ideology and bureaucratic infighting. The German program, now officially underway, quickly splintered into competing factions. The Army's Uranverein, led by Kurt Diebner, was based in a small laboratory in Berlin. Werner Heisenberg, meanwhile, was given his own research group at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. The two groups rarely collaborated, often working on the same problems independently and reaching different conclusions. This duplication of effort was a catastrophic waste of precious time and resources. Heisenberg, the most brilliant theoretical physicist in Germany, was focused on reactor design, believing that a self-sustaining chain reaction was the necessary first step before any bomb could be considered. He and his team began experiments with layers of uranium and heavy water, trying to achieve the critical mass needed for a reaction. In early 1940, a critical error occurred that would set the German program back by years. A team of physicists led by Walther both conducted experiments to determine if graphite could be used as a neutron moderator. Graphite was cheaper and more readily available than heavy water. However, both measurements suggested that graphite captured too many neutrons to be effective. Heisenberg's group accepted these results without question. This was a fatal mistake. The graphite both used contained trace amounts of boron, a powerful neutron absorber. Heisenberg. Pure graphite, as the American and British scientists would later prove, was an excellent moderator. The German team, through a simple experimental error, had eliminated the most practical path to a nuclear reactor, forcing them to rely entirely on the scarce and difficult-to-produce heavy water. Their quest for the bomb was now inextricably linked to the fate of a single factory in Norway. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemork, perched on a steep gorge in the Telemark region, was now the linchpin of the German atomic effort. In early 1940, as part of their invasion plans, the Germans secured an agreement with Norway to purchase all of Vemork's heavy water production. When Germany invaded and occupied Norway in April 1940, they simply took control of the plant. For the Allies, this was a disaster. They now had to prevent the heavy water from reaching Germany. The quiet, remote plant in the Norwegian mountains became the focus of one of the most daring and clandestine campaigns of the entire war. The first attempt to stop the heavy water production was made by Norwegian commandos in Operation Grouse, later renamed Operation Freshman. In November 1942, two gliders carrying British engineers and Norwegian commandos took off from Scotland, bound for a landing zone near Vemork. The mission was a catastrophe. Bad weather and navigational errors caused both gliders to crash. The survivors were captured by the Germans and, in violation of the Geneva Convention, executed as saboteurs. The failure was a bitter blow, but it only stiffened the resolve of the British Special Operations Executive (SOE) and the Norwegian resistance. They knew that too much was at stake to give up. Back in Germany, Heisenberg and his team continued their work, largely unaware of the desperate struggle being waged over their supply of heavy water. They received their first shipment from Norway in 1941 and began a series of experiments known as the Bunker IV experiments. In a bunker in Dahlem, a suburb of Berlin, they constructed a simple reactor, a spherical arrangement of uranium powder surrounded by heavy water. They measured the neutron multiplication, hoping to see it approach 1, the threshold for a self-sustaining chain reaction. The results were disappointing. The multiplication factor was far too low. They needed more uranium, more heavy water, and a better design. The path forward was slow, arduous, and increasingly dependent on a supply line that was under constant threat. The psychological toll on Heisenberg was immense. He was a man caught in the middle. He was leading his country's atomic program, yet he was privately pessimistic about its chances of success. He maintained a correspondence with his friend and mentor, Niels Bohr, in occupied Copenhagen. In September 1941, Heisenberg made a now infamous trip to Copenhagen to meet with Bohr. The exact content of their conversation remains one of the great mysteries of the war, as Bohr was deeply disturbed by the meeting and later gave conflicting accounts. It seems Heisenberg was trying to convey a sense of moral ambiguity, perhaps to suggest that he and other German scientists were deliberately slowing down the project to prevent Hitler from getting the bomb, or perhaps he was trying to probe Bohr for information about Allied efforts. The meeting was a failure, ending in misunderstanding and mistrust. It marked the final break between the two giants of physics, symbolizing the tragic division of the scientific community by the war. As 1942 drew to a close, the German atomic program was faltering. The experiments were not progressing, the bureaucracy was stifling, and the vital supply of heavy water was in jeopardy. In the United States, however, things were accelerating at a breathtaking pace. The Einstein-Szilard letter had finally borne fruit. In 1941, a British report known as the Maud Committee Report, which concluded that an atomic bomb was feasible, was brought to the attention of American officials. The report, written in clear, compelling language, was a wake-up call. It galvanized the American government into action. In August 1942, the Manhattan Project was officially born. General Leslie Groves, a tough, no-nonsense Army engineer, was appointed to lead it. He, in turn, selected J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant and charismatic theoretical physicist, to be the scientific director. Groves and Oppenheimer were an odd couple, but they formed a partnership that would prove to be extraordinarily effective. Groves provided the immense industrial and logistical might of the United States government, while Oppenheimer gathered the greatest collection of scientific talent ever assembled in one place. The race was no longer a contest, it was becoming a rout. The Germans, with their divided leadership, their ideological blinders, and their critical error over graphite, were falling hopelessly behind. The heavy water they so desperately needed was about to become the target of a legendary act of heroism that would sever their lifeline and cripple their program for good. The Winter Fortress, Vemork, Norway, February 1943. The winter night was a physical presence, a crushing weight of darkness and cold. The Telemark region, a landscape of deep gorges, frozen lakes, and snow-draped pine forests, was a world painted in shades of white and black. High above the valley floor, perched on a precipice majestic like an eagle's eyrie, sat the Norsk hydroelectric plant. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, a humming, clanking industrial beast that seemed alien in the pristine wilderness. But its true purpose was not to generate electricity for the surrounding towns. It was to produce heavy water, the clear lifeblood of the German atomic program. For the men of the Norwegian Special Operations Executive (SOE) who were observing it from a distance, it was a target that had to die. The failure of Operation Freshman had been a devastating blow. The loss of life was tragic, and the security of the plant had been massively increased. The Germans, now fully aware of its strategic importance, had surrounded it with mines, floodlights, and a garrison of seasoned Alpine troops. A direct assault was considered suicidal. The British and Norwegian resistance leaders knew they needed a new plan, one that relied not on brute force, but on stealth, endurance, and an intimate knowledge of the unforgiving Norwegian terrain. The plan they devised was audacious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its danger. The team selected for the mission was composed of 6 Norwegian commandos, all of whom had grown up in the mountains of Telemark. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were skiers, hunters, and outdoorsmen who knew the land as they knew their own hands. Their leader was a 23-year-old named Joachim Ronneberg. The plan, codenamed Operation Gunnerside, called for a 4-man advance party, codenamed Grouse, to be parachuted into the region in October 1942. Their job was to reconnoiter the area, establish a base, and wait for the main assault team. For months, they lived in a cabin high on the Hardangervidda plateau, surviving on reindeer meat and moss, their bodies growing lean and hard, their senses sharpened by the constant, biting cold and the ever-present threat of discovery. They sent back detailed reports on the German patrols, the minefields, and the plant's daily routines. Every piece of information was a precious commodity. On February 16, 1943, Ronneberg and his 5-man team, along with another group of 4 commandos, were dropped by Halifax bomber. The jump was a nightmare. The plane flew low over the plateau, buffeted by fierce winds. The men tumbled out into the darkness, their parachutes snapping open in the gale. One of the gliders broke apart on landing, but miraculously, no one was killed. The survivors regrouped, but they were now miles from their intended rendezvous point. For days, they struggled through a blizzard, the wind howling like a banshee, the snow blinding them. Frostbite was a constant danger, and exhaustion gnawed at their strength. But they were Norwegians. This was their home. They pushed on, driven by a grim determination. Finally, on February 22nd, the main assault team linked up with the Grouse party at their remote cabin. The reunion was brief and businesslike. There was no time for celebration. The plan was reviewed one last time. They would ski to a point on the steep gorge below the plant, cross the frozen river, and climb the 500-meter cliff face under the cover of darkness. It was a route the Germans considered impassable, a natural defense. It was their only way in. The night of the assault, February 27-28, was moonless and clear, the temperature plunging to 20 degrees C. The men, clad in white camouflage suits, moved like ghosts across the snow. They reached the base of the cliff and began their ascent, their ice axes biting into the frozen rock. It was a grueling, silent climb. Every scrape of metal on stone echoed in the stillness, a sound that seemed deafening to their own ears. They reached a narrow ledge about halfway up and paused, their chests heaving, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Below them, the valley was a void of blackness. Above them, the plant was a silent, illuminated monster. As they neared the top, they encountered a problem. A guard ladder which their intelligence had reported was there was missing. They had to improvise. Using a long steel rod they had brought for the purpose, they formed a human chain, boosting each other up the last few meters. They lay flat on the snow-covered ground, just meters from the plant's perimeter fence, their hearts pounding. A German patrol passed within a few feet of them, their boots crunching on the snow, their voices low. The commandos held their breath, their hands on their weapons. The patrol moved on. The way was clear. Ronneberg led his team through a gap in the fence. They split into 2 groups. One group was to provide cover and deal with any guards. The other, led by Ronneberg, was to enter the high concentration cellar and place the explosives. They found a cable duct that led directly into the basement. Crawling on their stomachs through the narrow, dark passage, they emerged into the heart of the target. The room was filled with large, cylindrical steel tanks, each containing several hundred liters of precious heavy water. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and oil. The mission was suddenly, terrifyingly real. Ronneberg and his demolitions expert, a man named Kjellstrup, quickly attached the explosive charges to the tanks. The British supplied charges were designed with a special delay fuse, but also with a shorter, non-standard fuse. Ronneberg, in the heat of the moment, chose to use the shorter fuse, wanting to ensure the charges detonate. It was a decision that would save their lives. With the charges set, they lit the fuses. A soft, sizzling hiss filled the room. "Get out, now," Ronneberg whispered. They scrambled back through the the cable duct, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They had just exited the plant and were melting into the darkness when a sharp, muffled crump echoed from inside the building. It was not the deafening explosion they had expected, but a deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the ground. A plume of steam and smoke billowed from a ventilation shaft. Inside, the heavy water tanks had been ruptured, their contents, representing months of German production, flooding the floor and pouring down the drains. The mission was a success. The escape was as perilous as the approach. The Germans were now in a state of high alert. Searchlights swept the gorge and patrols fanned out across the plateau. The commandos split into two groups to evade capture. Ronneberg's group skied for 2 weeks, covering over 400 kilometers, often traveling in blizzards to avoid detection. They survived on snow and a little reindeer meat they managed to find. Their feet were raw, their bodies exhausted, but they were free. They eventually made their way to neutral Sweden, from where they could send back the news. The heavy water plant at Vemork had been destroyed. The news of the sabotage was a monumental boost to Allied morale. It was a story of incredible courage and skill, a testament to the power of a small, determined group fighting against a seemingly invincible enemy. For the German atomic program, it was a catastrophe. Heisenberg and his team were left without a supply of their crucial moderator. Their experiments ground to a halt. The race was not just slowing down. For the Germans, it was effectively over. They had been dealt a blow from which they would never recover. The heavy water, the symbol of their scientific ambition, had been taken from them, not by a rival army, but by a handful of men on skis. In the United States, the Manhattan Project was operating on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. General Groves had proven to be a master of industrial logistics. He was building not one, but several massive secret cities in the middle of nowhere. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was a sprawling complex dedicated to the enrichment of uranium, using two different, incredibly complex methods: gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation, in a parallel, redundant effort to ensure success. Hanford, Washington, was the site of gigantic plutonium production reactors. The scale was staggering. Oak Ridge alone consumed more electricity than the entire city of New York. It was an industrial effort that dwarfed anything the Germans could have ever imagined, a testament to the unbridled economic and manufacturing power of the United States. The scientific heart of the project was at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Perched on a remote mesa, it was a secret city of scientists, a brain trust of the highest order. J. Robert Oppenheimer had gathered together the best physicists in the world, many of them the very men the Nazis had driven out of Europe: Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman. The list was a who's who of 20th century physics. They lived in a strange, isolated community, a mix of frontier town and Ivy League university. They worked with a feverish intensity, driven by the knowledge that they were in a race, and that the fate of the world might hang in the balance. The atmosphere was one of exhilarating intellectual challenge mixed with a profound sense of dread. In December 1942, a pivotal event occurred that cemented American belief in the bomb's feasibility. Under the stands of an abandoned football stadium at the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi and his team achieved the world's first man-made, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. Chicago Pile 1, as it was called, was a crude but brilliant assembly of graphite bricks and uranium pellets. As the control rods were slowly withdrawn, the neutron count on the instruments climbed steadily. At 3:25 p.m. on December 2nd, the pile went critical. A coded message was sent back to Washington. The Italian navigator has landed in the New World. The atomic age had begun, not with a bang, but with a quiet, sustained hum of power. Fermi had proven the theory. The path to a bomb was now a matter of engineering. While the Americans were scaling up from a successful experiment to an industrial behemoth, the Germans were trying to recover from a disastrous one. After the Vemork sabotage, they attempted to salvage what heavy water they could and ship it back to Germany. This set the stage for the final, tragic chapter of the heavy water saga. In February 1944, the Norwegian resistance, tipped off by SOE intelligence, learned that the remaining stockpile of heavy water was to be transported by ferry across Lake Tinstjo. They could not allow it to reach Germany. The plan was to sink the ferry, the Hydro. On the night of February 20th, 3 Norwegian saboteurs, led by Knut Haukelid, slipped aboard the ferry as it was docked. They placed a timed explosive charge in the ship's bow. The ferry departed, carrying not only the heavy water but also a number of Norwegian civilian passengers. It was a horrifying dilemma, but the strategic importance of the cargo was deemed too great to ignore. In the early hours of the morning, as the ferry was in the middle of the deep, cold lake, the charge detonated. The Hydro sank in minutes, taking with it the heavy water and 26 passengers. The German atomic program was dealt its final, fatal blow. The symbol of their ambition, the heavy water, now lay at the bottom of a Norwegian lake, forever out of their reach. By the middle of 1944, the two programs were in completely different worlds. In Germany, Heisenberg and his colleagues were still struggling to achieve a basic chain reaction. They were underfunded, their supplies were cut off, and their morale was low. The German High Command, having seen no progress, had shifted its focus and resources to more promising weapons projects, like the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The dream of an atomic bomb for Hitler was fading into a distant, unrealistic fantasy. In the United States, the dream was becoming a terrifying reality. The factories at Oak Ridge and Hanford were humming, and at Los Alamos, the scientists were no longer asking if they could build a bomb, but when. The reckoning at Farm Hall, Cambridge, England, May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the once mighty Third Reich was a smoldering ruin. In the quiet pastoral countryside of Cambridgeshire, a large, nondescript manor house known as Farm Hall stood surrounded by manicured lawns and tall trees. To the casual observer, it looked like any other English country estate, but it was not. Farm Hall was a gilded cage, a top-secret detention center run by MI6, and its 10 German residents were among the most important scientific prisoners of the war. They were the captured leaders of the German atomic program: Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Walther Gerlach, and 5 others. Unbeknownst to them, every room in the house was bugged with hidden microphones. Their conversations, their arguments, their moments of despair and elation were being recorded, transcribed, and analyzed by British and American intelligence. This was Operation Epsilon, and its purpose was to discover just how close the Nazis had come to building an atomic bomb. The atmosphere at Farm Hall was a strange mix of relief, anxiety, and intellectual boredom. The scientists were treated as honored guests, not common prisoners. They had access to a well-stocked library, a garden for walks, and were served meals by British staff. They were even allowed to listen to BBC radio broadcasts, but they were confined, cut off from the outside world, and acutely aware of their status as captives. The initial days were filled with discussions of their personal circumstances, the fate of their families, and the political situation in Germany. They debated the future, argued about who was to blame for the catastrophe, and tried to piece together what had happened in the final days of the war. The one topic they avoided, at least initially, was the very reason they were there: their work on uranium. Werner Heisenberg was the undisputed leader of the group. He carried the weight of his role heavily. He was a man of immense intellect and profound self-doubt, constantly questioning his own actions and motivations. He had stayed in Germany, served the Nazi regime, and led its atomic program. Why? Was it out of a sense of patriotism, a desire to preserve German science from within? Was it a pragmatic calculation that collaboration was the only way to protect himself and his family? Or was it, as his critics would later allege, a secret, deliberate effort to sabotage the project to ensure Hitler never got the bomb? The Farm Hall transcripts provide no easy answers, revealing a man of immense complexity, wrestling with his conscience in the quiet of an English country house. On the evening of August 6, 1945, the tranquility of Farm Hall was shattered. The scientists were gathered in the common room after dinner when a special BBC News bulletin was announced. The announcer's voice was calm and matter-of-fact, but the words he spoke were anything but. It has been announced by the White House in Washington that an atomic bomb, possessing more power than 20,000 tons of TNT, has been dropped on the important Japanese army base of Hiroshima. The room fell silent. The scientists stared at the radio, their faces masks of disbelief. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Otto Hahn, the chemist whose discovery of fission had started it all, was horrified. "I am sorry I ever started this," he exclaimed, his voice filled with anguish. He felt a profound personal responsibility for the destruction that had just been unleashed. Heisenberg, however, was skeptical. "I don't believe a word of it," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "The Americans couldn't have done it. It's propaganda." He immediately began to argue that the physics was wrong, that the technical hurdles were too great to have been overcome so quickly. His pride as a physicist was wounded. If the Americans had succeeded where he had failed, it meant he had fundamentally misunderstood something. The ensuing days were a whirlwind of intense, often acrimonious debate. The transcripts from these days are a goldmine for historians, providing an unvarnished look into the minds of these brilliant men. They argued about the technical details of the bomb. How was it detonated? What kind of fissile material was used? Uranium-235 or plutonium-239? How did they manage to separate the isotopes on such a massive scale? Heisenberg, initially the most vocal skeptic, was forced to reconsider his position as more details emerged from the radio reports. He and the others began sketching diagrams on blackboards, trying to reverse engineer the American weapon. A critical critical point of contention was the amount of enriched uranium needed for a bomb. Heisenberg initially estimated that it would take several metric tons, an amount that was clearly impossible to produce. This was a core reason for his belief that a bomb was impractical during the war. But as they discussed it, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Heisenberg's close colleague, had a moment of dawning realization. He suggested that the Americans might have used a different method, one that required only a few kilograms of enriched uranium. It was a concept they had considered but dismissed as too difficult. The realization that they had been on the right track but had simply lacked the industrial capacity and perhaps the theoretical boldness was a bitter pill to swallow. The most revealing conversation came on August 8th, the night before the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The scientists were discussing the morality of the weapon. Hahn was still distraught. Heisenberg, however, began to frame the issue differently. He argued that they, the German scientists, had never wanted to build a bomb for Hitler. He claimed they had deliberately focused on reactor technology, seeing it as a source of power for the post-war world, and had steered away from weapons research. This was the myth of the resistance, the idea that they had heroically sabotaged the project from within. The transcripts, however, show a more ambiguous picture. While they may have had moral qualms, their primary focus was on the immense technical challenges, not on a moral refusal. They were not trying to fail, they were simply failing to succeed. The arrival of a newspaper on August 9th with a detailed account of the Hiroshima bombing finally convinced Heisenberg. He read the article, which mentioned the critical mass of the bomb was likely around 10 kilograms of uranium-235. He looked up, his face pale. "I wouldn't have thought it possible," he said, his voice now quiet and subdued. The technical and psychological dam had broken. The Americans had done it. They had solved the problem that he and his team had been unable to crack. The weight of this failure settled upon him and the others. Their years of work, their struggles, their arguments had all been for nothing. They had lost the race, and the world had been irrevocably changed by their rival's success. The final, cruel twist came when they learned the identity of the scientific leader of the Manhattan Project. It was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant American theorist whom many of them knew personally. But more importantly, they learned that the project was staffed by a who's who of the physicists they had once worked alongside or admired. Fermi, Teller, Bethe, Szilard, Bohr. These were the very men the Nazi regime had dismissed and driven out of Germany. The irony was staggering. The German atomic program had been crippled from the start, not by a lack of German talent, but by the ideological fanaticism that had purged its most brilliant minds and forced them into the service of its enemies. Hitler's racial obsession had been his ultimate undoing. He had handed his enemies the weapon that would ensure his defeat. The scientists at Farm Hall were held for several more months, their every move and word monitored. The debates continued, but the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim acceptance. They began to think about the future. How would they rebuild German science? What role would they play in a world that now had to live with the threat of nuclear annihilation? The heavy water they had once coveted so desperately was now a historical footnote, a symbol of a failed dream. The race was over and they had lost. In October 1945, the scientists were released from Farm Hall and returned to a Germany that was a shattered, divided nation. The world they returned to was vastly different from the one they had left. The atomic age had dawned, and they were on its periphery, witnesses to a revolution they had helped initiate but failed to control. Werner Heisenberg would go on to become the director of the Max Planck Institute in West Germany, a respected elder statesman of science. But the shadow of Farm Hall and the questions it raised about his role and his judgment would follow him for the rest of his life. The Farm Hall transcripts, declassified in the 1990s, provided the final, definitive word on the German atomic program. It was not a story of heroism or sabotage, but a story of scientific error, bureaucratic incompetence, and the ultimate self-destructive power of ideological arrogance. The Germans had not been racing. They had been stumbling in the dark, while their rivals, armed with the genius they had rejected, had sprinted toward the finish line. Section Conclusion Epilogue. The echoes of a split atom. The story of the German atomic program is not merely a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a profound and cautionary tale about the self-destructive nature of ideological extremism. The Nazis, in their pursuit of a 1,000-year Reich, built their edifice on a foundation of sand. Their core belief in Aryan supremacy was not just a moral abomination. It was a strategic and intellectual suicide pact. By dismissing Jewish physics and purging their universities of some of the greatest minds on the planet, they did not purify their science. They crippled it. They created a vacuum of talent and a drought of ideas. And in that barren landscape, the atomic bomb could never grow. The most terrifying weapon ever conceived was not born from the ideology of hate, but from the open, collaborative, and international scientific culture that the Nazis so despised. The echoes of this historical paradox resonate to this day. The heavy water plant at Vemork is now a museum, a silent monument to a time when a handful of men on skis could alter the course of history. The transcripts from Farm Hall remain a stark reminder of how easily intellectual pride and political compromise can cloud moral judgment. They show a group of brilliant men capable of understanding the universe, yet unable to fully comprehend the moral universe they inhabit. Their story forces us to ask difficult questions about the responsibility of the scientist, the seductive power of nationalism, and the thin line between serving one's country and enabling its crimes. The ultimate lesson of this history is a simple yet devastating one. Ignorance and prejudice are the most powerful weapons of mass destruction of all. They dismantle from within, corrupting thought, stifling innovation, and turning potential allies into determined enemies. The Nazis did not need to be defeated by an atomic bomb. They had already defeated themselves. They had built a system that was fundamentally incapable of nurturing the very genius it needed to survive. In the end, their greatest vulnerability was not a military weakness or a lack of resources, but the fatal arrogance of believing they could rewrite the laws of physics to fit the laws of their hateful ideology. The atom was split, but the true explosion was the collapse of a worldview that was fundamentally at war with reality. The end story.